It has been a long time no see. You're alive.
I am. I'm actually surprised myself.
Is this your I think model? Is this the I think model for your for 5094? Yeah. It's a good case study. It should be a fun assignment. Yeah. Ignore. It's always dangerous to show your models around this. Yep. That's right. Oh, I forgot to do something.
You build yourself up and you think, fantastic, I've got through this requirement.
Yep.
Ticked every box. And then somebody else comes out and says,
What about the...
this happens.
Hmm.
No.
Yep, exactly. It's not good for your health. Eddie. This is, I think. And they charge a fortune for it too. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's opportunity for some open source stuff too, but they're so tight with their copyright. The IP that they've got on in the modelling technique itself is. I don't think anyone can actually create software that supports the technique. They'll get sued. So. Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. There's certainly quite a lot of simulation software out there. But I find for this kind of stuff, I actually prefer just using Excel. Does the job. Okay, let's get underway, guys. Welcome to the actual week 11. Last week I said it was week 11, but no, that was week 10. This week's week 11. And I scared the bejesus out of all of you because I said next week the assignment's due, and no, it is week 12. So that's all good. This week, particularly today, given most of you have got the 5094 lecture this evening, today is going to be governance day for you. We're doing data warehousing governance in this unit, and David's doing DSS governance tonight, so you're going to have your head full of governance stuff. Governance, and David will probably define it the same kind of way, governance is all about working out who has the appropriate authority to make certain kinds of decisions. And the broad field that we're looking at this week is, I guess, IT governance, but particularly the subset of IT governance that relates to governing data warehousing projects. Because as with the rest of the semester, my argument is that data warehouses are different, and that extends to some of the kinds of governance structures and governance decisions that get made with relation to data warehousing. And David's going to make a similar argument for decision support systems. In fact, what we're going to do this week, here's the overview. This Australian Financial Services Company case study that I was going to look at, I've actually taken out because David's doing it. It's actually a research project that David did work on. And even though it's a data warehousing case study, it forms the basis of the material that he's covering tonight in decision support systems. And this dot point down here, the stuff on chaotic and subversive systems, an argument for a particular approach to governing data warehouses, is research that I did, but it's specifically on decision support systems. So I'm taking DSS governance and turning it into data warehousing governance, and David tonight's taking data warehousing governance and turning that into decision support systems governance. So it's going to be an interesting Monday for you guys, I think. Anyway, this is what we're going to tackle. We're going to broadly explain what IT governance is and look at some of the key theories that from the information systems research literature that talk about IT governance and the kinds of decisions one makes about how to structure governance within organisations. We'll look at a couple of different models of data warehousing governance, and what we're going to find is that there's really not much literature at all on how to govern data warehousing projects. The bulk of the literature, and there is a lot of literature on IT governance, deals really just with transaction processing systems and traditional kinds of IT systems. And even though they don't sort of explain that, the researchers who do the work on IT governance pretty much focus solely on transaction processing, possibly ERP, enterprise scale systems, but not a lot on data warehousing. So we'll have a look at the literature that is there on data warehouse governance. We'll have a look at one very famous, often cited case study, the Blue Cross Blue Shield case study, which we're also looking at in the tutorial this week, largely because this is the only detailed case study about data warehousing governance in the literature. I'm not going to do the Australian Financial Services Company one. I'll leave that to David for tonight. And then we'll have a look at a paper I wrote a couple of years ago looking at how you might approach data warehouse governance to take into account the sort of evolutionary nature of data warehousing. Okay, so let's kick off by defining generally what IT governance is about and how we perhaps should think about IT governance. So as I said, IT governance, or governance in general, corporate governance, I guess, is the overall umbrella term, and IT governance comes under corporate governance, and data warehouse governance comes under that. The broad definition is that it's about who's got the rights and responsibilities for making decisions about, in this case, IT projects and IT resources. So there's three key sort of areas that decisions need to be made about with regards to IT governance. That's who should be making decisions about IT infrastructure. That includes both allocating resources to establish new infrastructure and as well as allocating resources to maintain existing infrastructure. Decisions about IT use, who gets to use which systems, who gets access to what kind of data, and so on. And then finally, project management. And a lot of IT governance literature really just focuses on project management. But governance is a broader concept than just project management. But obviously there's a lot of decisions made about who should be doing what, who gets to use what within the project management setting as well. But IT governance tries to be broader than any one single IT project, and project management tends to be very specific, of course, to particular projects. But project management fits into more general IT governance principles that should be in place in the organisation already. So there's decisions that need to be made in organisations about what structures to put in place to govern IT resources. These can be things like policy documents, they can be committee structures, working out who should be on which committees, how you incorporate representation from business and the IT department and so on. So governance is about putting in place those organisational structures to ensure that the right people are making the right decisions about IT management. Now, IT governance is quite important. It's a fairly topical thing in the literature, the IT literature at the moment, particularly because of the trend over the last 10 years or so of outsourcing. All of a sudden that brings into stark relief the responsibilities about decision-making for IT resources when a lot of those resources are operated by a third party. All of a sudden those governance structures, which might have been implicit when everything was done in-house, have to become explicit as service level agreements and contracts and things like that are set up to govern the operational side of IT. Project management's a perennial kind of issue, but because of the wide adoption of enterprise scale systems, large scale integrated systems like ERP and so on, as opposed to the more traditional kind of smaller scale, independent kinds of standalone kinds of systems. There's been a shift in the, I guess, the specific decisions that people make or organisations make about how to govern their IT resources. It's also been pushed along a bit by a guy called Nicholas Carr, who wrote a book about 7 or 8 years ago called IT Doesn't Matter. How many people have actually read that book? Or at least seen it? What do you think of it?
Yeah, it makes some interesting points. I mean, you get to a point where, like, sort of, you might be like, for like, Apple, for instance, like, you might come up with like an iPhone, like being like a front oral leader of the like smartphone technology. So after a while, everyone's going to come on and like you'll have to see a whole bunch of sort of different smartphones saturate the market. So you sort of, it's not really so much as an advantage. It's more like
it's a commodity kind of.
To make,
yeah, it's the minimum entry level to doing business is kind of his argument. Carr used to be an editor for Harvard Business Review, so was widely read by CIOs and CEOs. And the central argument of the book is that IT isn't a strategic asset; it's or a strategic function of a business. It's the minimum necessary equipment you need to do the job. But because everyone's got computing, everyone's got Microsoft Office, everyone's got smartphones. The competitive advantage one gets from actually using IT is quite small. Now, I reckon Carr's actually wrong. IT can be used quite strategically, and it's about thinking strategically about IT, and governance is an important part of being able to think of IT in a strategic kind of way. But Carr's book had an inordinate amount of influence on CEOs and CIOs and other C-level executives. So this idea that IT is kind of like the plumbing, it's kind of like the telephone system, that it's necessary, but it's whenever you're trying to manage those kinds of infrastructures, you're trying to minimise costs rather than invest money and view it as a strategic investment. So IT governance for the last couple of years has been strongly influenced by this view of, okay, well, IT is just about ticking the business over. We want to minimise costs there, outsource as much as we possibly can. Over the last couple of years, this strategic view of IT has started to make a bit of a comeback. But all of this influences the kinds of approaches to IT governance in organisations. So IT governance is something that a lot of people have been talking about in enterprises. So CIOs and CEOs and other C-level executives have been talking quite extensively about IT governance over the last few years. So one of the key theories, or what are the key theories that talk about governance from the information systems literature? Well, like I said, there's lots and lots of material out there, but I reckon a lot of the research literature is pretty anemic, I guess. They're focused on one particular kind of concept, and that's the locus of responsibility. So this concept, this theoretical concept of locus of responsibility, talks about where should the decision-making rights actually reside, and the sort of breakdown of that in most of the literature says, well, it depends on the nature of the organisation. If you've got a very centralised kind of culture, well then IT decision-making rights should be centralised. If you've got a decentralised culture, the opposite, so divisional business unit areas should be making the IT decisions, and of course the hybrid approach is a mixture of the two. And whilst it's a reasonable kind of concept, it does give some insight into how you might set up committees and allocate decision-making rights throughout the organisation. It doesn't really tell you how to go about doing that other than the broad structure. Anyway, the sort of one of the good papers that talked about this stuff came from Brown in 1997. He talked about using two different approaches for the different kinds of decisions being made with regards to IT governance. So for decisions about the actual management of the technology, decisions should be centralised. So what operating system do we use? What word processing package is deployed? What ERP system do we use? These should be all centralised decisions made by sort of head office, a centralised IT department. In terms of actual management of the usage of those systems, that should be more decentralised. So the closer the decision making about use is located to the actual users themselves, the better. So Brown argues for this kind of hybrid approach, but says, look, there really is no one universal solution. You have to sort of take it on a case-by-case basis. So given that kind of case-by-case mentality, what kind of factors influence that decision? Well, it really comes down to corporate culture and the overall sort of corporate governance structures in organisations. So Brown talks about mechanistic versus organic kind of structuring, whether it's a very top-down mandated organisational structure versus a kind of a natural grouping of people around certain business functions, and it's very adaptive over time. The level of autonomy of different business units, so how decentralised is the power structure in the organisation, as well as strategic influences like the competitive environment, how fast-moving the industry is. Some industries change faster than others, whether there's a new entrant into the marketplace and so on. How interrelated the different business units, the work groups are, and the nature of the actual products and services being sold or provided to customers. Sandler, Murphy and Zamor did some later work and talked about corporate governance being the key influence on IT governance. So the kind of corporate governance structures should be mirrored in IT governance structures. David might talk about this a little bit tonight. If he doesn't, it might be worth asking him about the idea of aligning IT governance with corporate governance. David's I think, coming of the opinion, we've had a few discussions on this, coming around to the opinion that it's actually impossible to align IT governance, or particularly data warehouse governance and decision support systems governance, with corporate governance, because things are always changing and always moving. So you get a certain level, do a lot of work to bring the governance structures into alignment, and then the corporate governance structure changes because of the competitive environment or the nature of the business changes. And so you're continuously catching up, and you never have things quite in sync. But anyway, Sandler, Murphy and Zamor cite corporate governance as probably one of the key factors. The other ones that they cite are how much leverage you can get from economies of scope. In other words, the more you centralise decision-making responsibilities, the more you can leverage scale to reduce costs and get sort of benefits from sharing resources across the firm. The more decentralised the decision-making structures are, the more business units make their own decisions about technology, the less homogenous the IT environment in an organisation. So you lose those sort of benefits of scale. And that's not to say that the economies of scale or economies of scope are the only thing that should drive your decision making with setting up an IT governance structure. It may be that you can't, the benefits outweigh, the costs outweigh the benefits. But it's still something to consider. The other thing is absorptive capacity, which is a theory within information systems that looks at how capable organisations are of adopting new technology. So an organisation with high absorptive capacity is one that is quite easily able to adapt and change to the introduction of a new technology in an organisation. Some organisations really struggle to adopt new technology. Any kind of new technology often creates significant amounts of resistance to change. So you need to take that into account when making governance decisions. So resistance to change is tied in there as well. Sandler, Murphy and Zamor actually come up with a neat little process model to help make decisions about governance structures, or really they're talking about IT architectures and governance structures adapted to those architectures. But their argument is that IT infrastructure should be a platform that creates a kind of ecosystem in an organisation, a platform for the functionalities of IT within an organisation. So they argued to come up with appropriate architectures and governance structures for those architectures. You need to, first of all, look at the critical IT capabilities of the organisation, think about where the gaps might be, and then design architectures to fit those gaps and support those capabilities. And then once the core components are identified, then you move on to thinking about, well, how do we integrate those core components to create a supportive, rich IT ecosystem in an organisation to allow strategic initiatives that use IT to flourish. So that's Sandberg, Matthew and Zabud, and that's kind of where the IT governance research and debate, I guess, if you call it that, sat for quite some time, for about 10 to 15 years, talking about centralised versus decentralised and things like that. One of the big sort of, I guess, game changers that came along in 2004 was a book written by Peter Weil and Jeannie Ross. We're never quite sure how to pronounce Peter's surname. Weil, Vale. I've heard him pronounce his own name 3 different ways on 3 different occasions, so I'm not too fussed that I'm not getting it right. But the book that Peter and Jeannie wrote looked at IT governance structures in lots and lots of different organisations. So they did case studies of lots and lots of organisations, hundreds of organisations. I think it was the top Fortune 1000 companies. So they surveyed as many as they could and asked them, well, who makes critical decisions in your organisation? What they did was they came up with a framework that described the kinds of IT governance decisions that have to be made, as well as the different kinds of people who make those decisions, the different sort of models that you might have in various organisations. Their model of who makes those decisions actually quite closely follows Davenport's model of information politics that we talked about a few weeks ago. Feels like years ago. So they have this matrix of across the top, the kinds of decisions, and on the sort of y-axis, the people who are responsible for making those decisions. They took that framework and went out to lots and lots of different organisations and said, well, which cells do you fit into? For this decision, who's responsible for making it? For this decision, who's responsible for making it? And then they compared the successful organisations to the unsuccessful organisations and were able to come up with a kind of average of, for the most common successful organisations, make their decisions in these kinds of ways. So the decisions that they look at focus on two basic types, what we call behavioural and normative kinds of questions. Behavioural questions are about how the organisation acts, how it can act, and so on. Normative decisions relate to how things should be done, how things are enforced, and how values and principles are embedded into the organisation. So Will and Ross talk about decisions about how to ensure effective management and use of IT. That's one aspect of the behaviour of an organisation with regard to IT. And who should make those decisions, so who's actually performing the action of making the decision. And then the normative question of, well, once those decision responsibilities have been allocated, how do we make sure that those people are in fact making those decisions and that they're actually making the right kinds of decisions? So that's the normative side of things. They argue that any kind of mechanism, any structures that you've got for governance in an enterprise, and this is kind of true of any kind of governance, not just IT governance, the mechanisms need to be simple, transparent, and appropriate or suitable for the enterprise. The reason for this is because as the organisation operates, the decisions that get made can be quite rapid and quite complex, and people in the enterprise need to have an intuitive, grounded understanding of who should be making certain decisions. Where that's not the case, you'll find all sorts of different people taking it upon themselves to make certain decisions. So, for example, the project manager of a particular IT project may decide make significant decisions about the nature of, say, data quality or how the system's going to operate, who the users are going to be, and so on. When really that should be allocated to perhaps the steering committee or some other decision-making body. So the more simple, the more transparent, and more appropriate the governance structures are in an enterprise, the more likely that they will naturally be followed by people in the enterprise anyway. So it's a self-reinforcing kind of thing. Okay, so what are the specific decisions that Wheel and Ross identified? Well, they argued that there's decisions about the IT principles. So, what is the role of IT within the business? What are the fundamental principles underpinning the IT in the enterprise? There's decisions about IT architecture, so coming up with standards, coming up with decisions about how different components will integrate with each other, the level of integration that's required. And each of these, I should have mentioned, each of these decisions influences the next one down. So the architecture decision is based on the IT principles, maybe principles about data quality, security, reliability, and so on. Once the architecture, the overall structure of the IT in the enterprise is defined, then the IT infrastructure itself can be identified. And from that, then we can start thinking about the actual applications, the software and the tools that business units actually use to run the business. And then finally, decisions about IT investment and prioritisation. So how much money gets allocated, who decides what gets allocated to particular IT problems, IT projects that need to be undertaken. So those are the different types of decisions that runs across the top of the Weil and Ross framework. And down the side we have the people responsible for making those different decisions, the different kinds of models that are found in various enterprises. So as I said, this kind of follows quite closely to Davenport's structure about information politics. We've got a business monarchy where the top managers make the decisions about those things that we saw on the previous slide. The IT monarchy is the other side, so the IT department makes the decisions. The feudal structure is where different business units make their own decisions, so it's a highly decentralised kind of structure. A more centralised or more cooperative kind of approach is where you have a federal structure, where a combination of the IT department, or possibly the IT department, but certainly a cross-section of different business units get together and make decisions about those topics we saw before. IT duopoly is when the IT department and maybe one other business unit get together and make decisions for the enterprise. And finally, anarchy is where there's no consistent structure. So what they did was, as I said, create this matrix with the kinds of decisions and who makes them, kinds of decisions across the top, who makes them down the side, and then surveyed lots and lots of different organisations and highlighted the most common kinds of structures for successful organisations. And this is what they came up with. So for IT principles, they argued that the most commonly successful structure is an IT duopoly. So IT department working with just one business unit. IT architecture decisions are largely the domain of the IT department itself. Similarly for the infrastructure strategies. But in terms of business application needs and IT investment, there was a much wider sort of range of different models identified. So there was a combination of IT duopoly or federal, and in terms of investment, there was business monarchy as well as the federal and duopoly kind of structures. So these are the kinds of findings they come up with. And this is, as I said, was a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how information systems research looked at IT governance kinds of issues. So it moves beyond just the simple centralised versus decentralised to actually identifying specific entities within the enterprise that are responsible for making specific kinds of decisions. Okay, any questions about this framework and IT governance in general? No. The Weil and Ross book is it's fairly affordable as far as sort of academic books go. It's about $50 or so. Lots of second-hand copies out there as well, and it's very easy to read. So I'd highly recommend getting a copy of that book. There's copies in the library too, of course, but it's a good resource to have. Okay, so that brings us to the issue of data warehouse governance and the existing literature that's out there. So the argument that I'm making today and that other data warehouse governance researchers make is that data warehousing is somehow different to other kinds of IT. And that's the running theme throughout the semester. So data warehouse governance, even though it's a subset of IT governance, the conclusion or the hypothesis that we have here at Monash and as well as with other researchers is that because data warehousing is different, the kinds of decisions you might make about who should make certain kinds of decisions might be different for data warehousing versus other kinds of IT. Now, the Weil and Ross research, because it was such a wide-ranging survey and because they didn't really differentiate between different kinds of IT, most of the data, the results that they got back, or the data that came back from the different enterprises, would have been about generic IT kinds of systems, and perhaps people would have most likely been thinking about ERP, maybe applications and desktop kinds of resources and so on. So we don't think that Wheel and Ross is probably indicative of the kinds of data warehouse governance decision structures you might come up with. However, the data warehousing governance literature, as small as it is, there's only about 7 or 8 different journal articles out there on data warehouse governance, tends to mirror the kinds of debates that were happening in IT governance in general in the 1990s. In other words, most of the literature just focuses on that debate about whether a structure should be centralised or decentralised or a hybrid kind of structure. But probably the most accurate thing I can say about the literature is that there's a distinct lack of literature on data warehouse governance. But for what's out there, let's have a look. Ang and Teo wrote a paper or published a paper in 2000 where they talked about 7 different management issues that relate to governance. But really, I reckon these management issues relate more to project management rather than data warehouse governance specifically. And if you look here at these things, there's really not much here that's too different to sort of good IT project management anyway. Other than the kinds of recommendations like adopting an incremental approach. Because of the evolutionary nature of data warehousing, it's usually a bad idea to take a sort of a broad-brushed approach where you try to build the entire warehouse in one go. A much better strategy is to choose a pilot case study. I've been listening to Felix's PhD confirmation where he was talking about pilot case studies. A pilot project where you identify a specific business area and develop a small-scale, perhaps data mart for that business area, and then iteratively grow the warehouse over time. What else is there that's specific to data warehousing? Nothing really. Scalability and warehouse maintenance, these are issues that really apply to any kind of IT project. So that's Ang and Teo. This is going to test my tie. Sujit Parapataya. That rolls off the tongue. The SJ and G paper. They looked at this sort of centralised and decentralised debate as well, and so based their research on that. But they actually came up with I guess, a moderately useful framework that allows us to, I guess, make some prescriptions about what certain enterprises should adopt. So they surveyed 6 different organisations, so they labelled them A through to F, and they looked at whether or not they used a centralised or decentralised kind of governance structure, and compared that to the style of data warehouse that they had. So they compared enterprise data warehouses versus data mart kind of structures, and then looked at the decisions about IT infrastructure, the decisions about IT use, and whether they were corporate centralised decisions or divisional decentralised decisions. And they, of course, looked at project management as well. So they identified those 3 different decision types. This was expanded by Wheel and Ross later to the 5 that we saw a second ago. And they identified the style of IT governance for those different organisations. So for the sort of data mart kind of structures, they found that there was a tendency towards decentralised decision making, and that kind of makes sense. And the more enterprise style structures, you ended up with a centralised kind of, you had centralised kind of governance structures as well. So they came up with an influence diagram. Some of you will be familiar with the concept of an influence diagram. If you're doing systems dynamics, that's a kind of influence diagram. Their argument is that the style of IT decision making will lead to a decision broadly about whether to go for a data mart or an enterprise scale warehouse approach. So if you've got a decentralised decision making style, you're more likely to go for a data mart approach. But the decision that you make there, the choice that's selected at that stage, is going to influence 3 key things: the quality of the information in the warehouse, the quality of the system itself, the reliability and so on, and overall user acceptance. And in terms of the literature, that's really all there is on data warehouse governance. There's a few other papers kicking around, but in terms of key theories, that debate about centralised versus decentralised is still going on in, well, not still going on, but that's as far as sort of data warehouse governance has really got. We haven't made that leap that happened with the Weil and Ross work in IT governance to data warehouse governance. or decision support governance for that matter. So those are the theories. There's a couple of different case studies of looking at research projects, that report research projects investigating different enterprises, governance approaches. And the one that seems to be most often cited, and it's incorporated in lots of teaching courses on data warehousing and so on, including this one, is a case study of a health insurer from the US called Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Blue Cross and Blue Shield is a very large sort of group of health insurance providers in the US, and the North Carolina division is one of the bigger ones. Watson Fuller and, here we go, Arya Chandra, went to the Blue Cross and Blue Shield and looked at how they structured how they approached developing their data warehouse, and focused particularly on the governance structures that they put in place as the warehouse was developed and as it was being used in an ongoing basis. So Blue Cross and Blue Shield is, like I said, one of the larger health insurers. They've got particularly dominant in North Carolina. They've got 2.8 million customers, and they provide services to other insurers as well. So they provide reinsurance services. And they had a couple of key things that they wanted to address with their data warehouse. They wanted the ability to provide information access. So there were previously silos of information. They had lots of different transaction processing systems in the organisation, claims processing, a whole range of other different systems. And it was very difficult to get information from those various systems and integrate them from a reporting perspective. So it's kind of a classical data warehousing scenario, and the data warehouse was developed to try to break down those silos to make it easier to get access to information. One thing that they found as they got into the project, it wasn't a key driver at the start of the project, but they found it popped up as the project was going along, was data quality was a real issue. So they wanted the data warehouse to improve data quality, and also allow them to do what would today be called sort of master data management, coming up with common definitions of terms, so that different business units could actually talk to each other and have a common understanding of what the data actually means. And they wanted to also fix up the data resources and the sourcing. There was lots of different sort of mini ETL processes going on for the ad hoc kind of reporting systems that have been thrown together and had sort of organically emerged over time. So they wanted to replace all of that with a consolidated enterprise data warehouse. And the outcome was that they improved reporting. This is another thing that they wanted to achieve. They wanted to improve reporting because they were in a fairly complex regulatory environment as well. So laws are being introduced with regards to privacy, the ability to for a consumer to change one insurer for another. It'll be interesting to see how they're coping with the most recent changes to healthcare in the US, but this was going on in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And all of this was stopping them from doing effective decision support in the organisation. So these are the design goals. These were the sort of areas of decision support that were being focused on. So actuarial and underwriting, the sort of core insurance business, making predictions about future claims and investment, and making sure that funds are available to pay out claims as they're made. Marketing, financial analysis, and health services analysis. So one of the things that they do is obviously connect patients to healthcare providers. They also do a lot of provision of health information to consumers as well. So the design goals were, these here, mostly a lot of them focused on the nature of the data itself. So improving data quality, making it easier to access, more reliable, and more intuitive for end users who aren't necessarily technical people, and improve the overall level of decision support. So as of 2004, this was the size of their warehouse. Over 200 tables, about 2.5 terabytes in size. The data warehouse server itself was a massively parallel processing server, 68 different CPUs, with 12 source systems feeding in. 5 of them internal systems, 6 of them external, and a couple of other systems thrown in there as well. So that's kind of the complexity that they had. From a governance perspective, they needed to do a couple of things. First of all, they needed to work out what these decision support requirements were actually going to be and prioritise them. So they came up with a way of doing that, and that's kind of requirements elicitation and analysis. But the foundation that they established of how to tackle those requirements and prioritising those requirements formed the basis of their overall governance structure as the data warehouse moved on to becoming an established system. So their governance structure needed to identify what the business needs were and align, find out what the alignment was with the corporate sort of strategy and goals, and work out what the information requirements were and which ones were the most critical, the most important. And they came up with a ranking system of, well, they identified the requirements and then worked out whether they were critical or not. And they also mapped those to the different business areas. So each decision support requirement may actually touch on a number of different business areas. So they mapped the business areas to the requirements and then prioritised those accordingly. And then use that as the guide to how do we, or what do we focus on with the actual warehouse development. So they came up with actually two different structures. One structure was for the warehouse team itself. So they've got a vice president, sort of officer level person running the system. That's interesting. Time machine gets me every now and then. So an officer level vice president overseeing the whole approach, and a director of the data warehouse project. But they ended up establishing 4 different teams within the overall data warehousing team. There was a team looking just at decision support consulting, so a team of analysts who could help the business users come up with decision support requirements and develop systems, the sort of delivery systems, the front-end systems, to help them with that. So that's really front-end user support, training and development and so on. There's also the data modelers, the business information design and architecture team. So they're responsible for logical and physical data modelling. There's the data warehouse project management and development team, and that's really about project management for both the small-scale projects to develop different front-end reporting systems, as well as the project management for the ongoing evolution of the data warehouse itself. And then finally, data warehouse operations and quality control. So this is where I guess the techos sit and make sure that the warehouse is running on a day-to-day basis and that it's reliable. So that's the data warehousing team itself. In terms of the governance structure, on top of all of that, they actually had 3 different levels of governance decision-making going on. So there was a committee at the vice president level, there was a committee at the director level, and a committee at sort of the smaller scale business unit level. And the oversight team provided the broad direction and prioritisation for the warehouse. So representatives were there from a number of different business units, so there's cross representation, but it's chaired by the vice president of the corporate data warehouse. The data development oversight team was at the director level, so you notice that most of those people there are directors or senior directors or managers, and this is allowing for a more detailed analysis of the requirements across the business. Notice there's still a cross-section of different business representatives there, but they're more closely placed towards the operations of the organisation. And then finally, down here, we've got a number of different analysts and decision support actual users on a committee as well. So broad directions, specific kinds of projects, and then specific kinds of user requirements, user representation there. So this is the governance structure itself, whereas the previous slide is more the actual project team itself. So some of the key lessons that came out of that paper, that research project, one of the things they found was that senior management support, which is something that's often cited in the literature, is important, but not, well, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You've got to have real passionate involvement of management. And one way they did that was by getting that cross section of the organisation represented at different levels in the governance structure. So there was ongoing and active engagement between the data warehouse development team and the business. So it was really if we look at the Weil and Ross structure, a federal kind of approach, really a collaborative approach. Data quality should be a strategic issue, viewed as a strategic issue. This was something that Blue Cross Blue Shield discovered themselves as the project went along. And you often need different committees, sometimes with a business focus, sometimes with a technical focus. You need to make sure the right people are on those committees and a cross-section of views are represented in those committees. And they also found that it was really important to train and educate the committee members themselves about data warehousing, what capabilities a data warehouse can do, what the important principles are of business intelligence and data warehousing. And just one last slide on this case study, and this is not in the paper itself. This structure that Blue Cross Blue Shield came up with was reported in the academic literature, and it was obviously heavily cited. They even won an award from the sort of local data warehousing professional body. Said this is the way you should structure things. But a couple of one or two representatives of the data warehousing team from Blue Cross Blue Shield actually came out to Australia for a conference a little while ago, and we caught up with them and said, "Oh, it's amazing. You're almost famous in the data warehousing world. You're like rock stars. Tell us about this governance structure." What they said was, "Well, this is the governance structure we actually planned. This is what they actually came up with, and it got reported and published and so on. But by the time it actually came round to the data warehouse going live, this structure was completely scrapped. They came up with something completely different. So even though they won awards and it's cited as the way to structure things, not so much. It was just too complex for them. So they came up with something that was actually a lot simpler. But of course, that hasn't been reported in the literature. So anyway, don't take it with a grain of salt. It's important to read and understand, but just be aware that everything that appears in the literature doesn't necessarily actually ring true. Okay, so what I want to do now is move into talking about a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago for a conference looking at decision support systems governance. What we might do is, it's a logical point to take a break. So we might take a 5-minute break, go grab a coffee, come back, and we'll talk about this paper. And I'm going to argue for a particular approach to thinking about governance structures, particularly for decision support systems and data warehousing. So take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and talk about that. Yep.
I was talking to Scott on Friday, and he mentioned that at some point there was a conference paper submitted from DSS Lab. I'm not sure who in particular was involved, but the article itself, the paper itself, was sort of from a design science point of view. So I'm not sure what is the actual topic of it. Does it ring any bells?
There's a couple of papers. David's done some. We also had a PhD student who used design science as his research method. So it was Ratnan. So Ratnan published a paper at the 2008 Toulouse conference on decision support systems.
Right. So I might need to borrow the structure of this.
Sure. I think if you're trying to work out how to do a design science project, March Hebner and Widmeyer, I can't remember the other authors, but there's two key papers, but the Hebner paper is the one to look at.
It's not that I need to figure out how to do it, because I'm already doing it. It's just I need to work out how to write about it.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, we'll have a look at Ratnan's paper. But I'm not sure. The conference paper is a bit small to get a real good feel for how to write up a design science thing. So the key thing with design science is the sort of the looping that you do.
Yeah, the looping. Well, that's a lot of.
So you need to describe that kind of iterative development of ideas and solutions. Yeah.
And going on, hitting walls over and over.
Felix, how was did you get confirmed?
No, you didn't.
It's like I just see you so relaxed now.
Sarcasm.
Yeah. Sarcasm 1 week.
Yeah. what a business is?
What a measurement is, or what a success is.
That's what doing the project is all about, isn't it? I bumped into
But that thing with managers,
Mm.
it's funny because it comes from management information system, and how much all the fields that are reviewed come from the management information system quarterly.
Yeah.
Management.
That's tacit assumptions that are made. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how many people are actually managers versus are more sort of operational people, the Monash project.
Problem in getting the articles on the web, especially for critical success factors. I tried looking out in the library. I got one David Allen.
Okay.
There's a list of references that he went into writing an article.
Yep.
I tried to get those, but it was too old. I mean, we don't have those anymore. Especially
How are you
interested in
searching?
Nanda Kumar.
How are you searching for it? These are journal paper notion. So are you going to the electronic resources? Yep.
I'm also using the latest search engine which searches across data, which ProQuest.
Yeah.
But then it's good if you get the number, the journal name, the number, the volume number, and then you go from electronic journals to the paper.
So for the big journals like MISQ and so on, we've actually got paper companies going back to.
Would it still be that? I guess it should be relevant enough, even the older one.
Oh yeah, look, if the theory is good, then it should be relevant regardless of whether it's 5, 10 years old. You know, we're still using theories from physics that are 150 years old. So mathematical theories are been around for a couple of thousand years. So the theory itself doesn't age. It's more a matter of what's been done since then on that particular area, so refinements to it and so on. But yeah, just because it's something old doesn't mean it's not very good.
Could you guide me how any specific database or somewhere? Or how should I go about looking for it?
I use Google Scholar, so scholar.google.com, and then do a search for critical success factors. You may not, you'll find a couple of those scales, but the thing with Google Scholar is that it's a much broader search, and the downside of that is that some of the stuff you catch in that broader search, there's a lot of stuff you've got to wait for to find exactly what you're looking for. When you do find a paper that you're interested in, you can then use the library don't worry too much if you're using something that's not A-star. Obviously A-star is the preference, but an A or B or even a C journal is still quite a it's still being peer reviewed. It's certainly worth citing. But you might need to perhaps change your search to run these critical success factors for project management. It's often those talk about is how the project worked. So maybe case studies, data heads and case studies, those kinds of things. That will give you some insight into the factors that contribute to a successful project. So don't worry too much if it's not a critical success factor. Just look for important factors.
Normally for say ERP and all, there's a readily available literature, quite extensive on critical success. I mean, we could get.
There's a whole lot of stuff on executive information systems and critical success factors. EIS is really just what we call BI today. And you might be able to extrapolate from EIS to data warehouse. If the data warehouse is providing support for a BI system, then these kinds of things apply as well. But yeah, because across the board there's not much data warehouse literature. It's not a very well researched area. And most of the literature tends to be very computer science oriented rather than information systems oriented.
Detail or how to.
Yeah, that's right. In column databases versus in-memory databases. Yeah, exactly. So just keep plugging away and extend the search terms
be willing to sort of make the argument to extrapolate the one out to
Instead, will be reference that PIS even if we are extrapolating and giving our insight of what we perceive is how it would work out in database.
You still need to base it in the literature and the theories. So you might use evolutionary theory and things like that. Talk about how to manage evolutionary as being important to success. So you can draw on DSS and EIS literature. You still need to cite them. But obviously an essay is more than just the citations, it's how you piece those together and the logic and the reason that you use to tie all those things together. It's your justified position. So an essay is actually a contribution you're making. It's not just reporting what other people have done.
Even if I won't be able to cover across all whatever literature is there in data warehouses. Even if I cannot get something that it might be that somebody else would have thought or cited that. In the end, how do I say that, okay, where is my contribution coming in?
Your contribution is in the logic and the argument you craft using the citations. So the citations are like the foundation for your work. You piece those bits together to something substantive you're saying about the topic. You'll find different lists of critical success factors. You'll find critical success factors from later areas like the AS. And you can make the argument about, well, here's my list of what I think are the most important because the citations are sufficient.
It's still it has to be based on cited. Our argument has to be based on. It would be a tiny bit of our contribution and rest would be.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's not a PhD thing. This is tiny research essay. So we're not expecting grand contributions, but it's still going to be your position, your considered opinion.
Right, let's get underway again. So what we've been talking about is governance, and governance is all about the allocation of rights and responsibilities for making decisions about, in this case, data warehousing resources in an enterprise. So what I want to move on to now is to talk about a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago, and any excuse I've got for a captive audience to listen to my work, I'm going to use and abuse. The reason I'm citing myself is because, as I said earlier, there's really not much work out there on data warehouse governance. And really this is actually DSS governance rather than data warehouse governance. I'm going to make the argument that DSS and data warehouses are kind of the same thing.
So we can use it for the assignment?
Yeah, you can cite it. Yeah, go nuts. You need to use it properly, though. David's also written some work on this material, so the stuff that David will talk about tonight is based on his research with the Australian Financial Services Company case study that he did. The paper was trying to lay out an argument for moving beyond just the mindset of governance being about centralised versus decentralised kinds of structures to try to work out, well, what's different about data warehousing and what can organisations do to take into account that difference. And the argument centres on two ideas, and that's that decision support systems and, as a result, data warehouses are two things. They're, on one hand, they're chaotic, and I'll explain what I mean by that. We've already looked at a little bit about the idea of applying chaos theory to data warehouse development, but I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that in the next few slides. And then the second idea is that decision support systems and data warehouses, by extension, are subversive systems. They change or challenge the status quo in organisations by the nature of their design. By intent, they're subversive. So these are the two key ideas that I want to explore first and foremost. So the first idea, that the data warehouses are chaotic, goes right back to the initial kind of papers that describe decision support systems. For those of you who've done 5094, you'll remember that in the 1960s there were the the old MIS systems, which were a complete failure. Personal decision support systems came in the 1970s as an antidote to that. And the paper that, the first academic kind of paper that just really described or coined the term of decision support systems was written by two people, Gorey and Scott Morton. Scott Morton is the entire surname. The guy's name wasn't Scott. So Gorey and Scott Morton in 1971 wrote a paper describing systems to support two different kinds of decision-making styles. And the decision support systems term was specifically intended to address what they called strategic or semi-structured decisions. Does everyone know what I mean by a semi-structured decision, or the idea of structuredness of a decision? Anyone who doesn't? I'm just wondering whether I need to talk about it much or not. Okay. It follows from Herbert Simon's work on decision making, where he talked about programmed versus unprogrammed decisions. And Herb Simon was started off as a sort of management researcher and moved into computer science and artificial intelligence. And a lot of his work was looking at how you can perhaps automate management decision making. He had this kind of utopian vision of no one ever having to work again, because you've got this fully automated factory with machines and production lines being run by robots, and the management wing being run by computer systems making management decisions. So he was interested in different kinds of decisions and how amenable they were to being automated or getting computers to make those decisions. And he found that there were some decisions that were fairly easily made by computer systems with an algorithmic kind of approach, and some decisions weren't. So he coined them programmed versus unprogrammed decisions. Unprogrammed decisions, there's no simple, easy answer. There's no simple algorithm to making the decision. They tend to be highly strategic, dealing with sort of values and principles and grey areas, if you like, where there's no hard, clear-cut decision, or no clear-cut right decision to make. So Gorey and Scott Morton took that idea and rephrased it, structured and unstructured, and argued that decision support systems are aimed not at fully unstructured decisions, because it's impossible to get any sort of meaningful support for a completely unstructured decision. It's just too hard. And for completely structured decisions, well, it's kind of pointless building a decision support system, because people know how to make the decisions anyway. So the sweet spot for DSS is kind of the semi-structured decisions, where there's enough structure to build algorithms and computer systems to do analysis and so on to help with the decision-making process, but not so much not so much structure that it's pointless to actually build the system in the first place. So that's what they were talking about. They argued that the second kind of system that you can build to support decision making, they called structured decision systems. What today we would call operational decision making, and operational business intelligence. It's interesting to see the BI vendors moving more and more towards operational BI. It's become a popular term over the last couple of years. And that's really talking about what Gorey and Scott Morton identified back in the 1970s. Even though business intelligence is sort of seen as the descendant of decision support systems, it seems more and more we're moving towards supporting this second kind of decision and kind of throwing our hands in the air with the more strategic or semi-structured kinds of decisions. The vendors seem to be abandoning it. I think it's probably for commercial reasons. You can sell more licenses to operational decision makers because there's more of them. But still, there's a critical need for support at that strategic level. So data warehousing designed to support proper decision support systems is aimed at those semi-structured decision problems. And they're decision problems that tend to evolve and change. They're sometimes once-off decisions. So this underpins that need for evolutionary development. As you solve a particular decision problem with a decision support system, it may be that you throw that system away. You don't need to use it anymore because you've actually learned something. You've made the decision, and that's all you needed the decision support system for. So there's a high level of unpredictability about the use of decision support systems because they're evolutionary, and Peter Keen's work that we've looked at describes that very eloquently. So the usage of decision support systems are unpredictable, and as a result their development path is also unpredictable, and that means that the infrastructure that provides the support for decision support itself is unpredictable in terms of the directions that it's going to go. So decision support systems drives data warehouse change, and the nature of the decision support systems change is unpredictable, therefore the data warehousing change is going to be unpredictable as well. Okay. David's done some good work that he got published talking about evolution development for DSS, and one of the key ideas that he identified was that not all DSS are big enterprise scale kinds of systems. A lot of decision support systems are what he called ephemeral systems. They're systems that are developed once and then perhaps thrown away. They're small scale, they might be spreadsheet based or some other kind of small temporary kind of system. They're not classical IT systems that have to be engineered for longevity. So you get this kind of evolutionary lineage over time of a system with a particular decision support project. And this is sort of a timeline or an ancestry, if you like, of a particular decision support systems project that he investigated, and which chances are I think you probably talked about in 5094. But you can see that there's this branching effect. Systems evolve over time, and so any data warehouse designed to support that has to evolve and change over time as well. So my argument is that data warehouse development and use is chaotic. It's in the sense that it's unpredictable and it evolves. Okay, so and that's quite different to more traditional kinds of IT. So IT systems development tends to be, well, ideally very well planned. We use a development methodology to plan out the different phases as the system gets built, and there's a definite end time and delivery time for the system being handed over to the client, and we keep the system maintained and operational over time, and hopefully it continues to satisfy the original requirements that were identified at the start of the project. Completely different to the kind of decision support data warehousing environment, that chaotic nature. Okay, so that's the first sort of key point of my argument. The second point is that DSS are subversive, and therefore data warehouses are subversive as well. And my claims for this particular part of my argument rests on a theory from a researcher called Wanda Olakowski, and she's done a lot of work looking at the relationship between technology in an organisation and the organisational structures that are built up around technology. And her work is largely based on the work of a sociologist called, it's just popped out of my head, structuration theory, Giddens, Anthony Giddens. Giddens is perhaps the most famous sociologist at the moment. So if you've done any sort of work in arts faculties doing sociology, you're bound to have come across Giddens' work. For a while, he was the head of the London School of Economics, which is a particularly prestigious position to hold. And his key theory is what he calls structuration theory, and it looks at how the interaction of people and society and the structures in society. And what Olakowski did was take Giddens' work and apply that to enterprises and the use of IT and structures in enterprises. So the key idea of Giddens' theory is that human action happens typically in a social environment. Most of us live in a society, and there's a whole range of rules and structures that govern the kinds of actions that society considers are acceptable or not acceptable, or appropriate in certain situations and not appropriate. And there's a whole range of structures that are built up around those kind of conventions. Sometimes they may be very formal structures like laws and a justice system, for example, or they may be sort of informal structures, what's polite and what's not polite, peer influence and those kinds of things. So there's a whole range of different structures in society that influence individual actions. But Giddens' insight was that not only do the structures influence individual actions, but individual actions also influence social structures too. So social structures change and evolve based on action. So what was extremely rude and impolite, or maybe even illegal 100 years ago, is now accepted practice. And as I'm getting older and older, I'm now no longer sort of Generation X, and it used to be now Generation Y coming along. I'm starting to get old and curmudgeonly myself, thinking, these young whippersnappers, they can't act like that. You can't do that sort of thing. It's wrong. But society's norms and values change over time, and Giddens' theory is about this bi-directional influence between social structures and human activity. It goes both ways. The key concepts within structuration theory are signification, legitimation, and domination. Signification is the sort of signs and language and ways in which we act that enforce the acceptable versus non-acceptable kinds of actions. So the social structures are embedded in communication, language, and signs, So, you know, even if you look at, say, a lecture theatre, there's an implicit kind of structure with me standing at the front, you guys all looking at me, that all the chairs are structured in a particular way. That creates a kind of power structure, which is kind of the accepted kind of practice that Monash says is how a lecture should operate. And that's communicated through the architecture and as well as the sort of actions that I take and so on. Signification drives legitimation. In other words, what are the actual values and normative aspects of social action? What are the accepted processes for acting in a social situation? And finally, domination is about enforcing those norms and values, and what actions are taken when there's transgressions against those norms and values. So enforcing those principles. So that's Giddens' structuration theory. What Ołachowski did was to take that and apply that to organisational settings and technology. And she talked about institutional properties or enterprise structures, and the relationship between people acting within those enterprises and the use of technology to facilitate those actions. And she argued that there's actually, just as with structuration theory, there's a two-way bidirectional influence between action and structure. In an enterprise with technology, technology can facilitate action. It can also enforce certain kinds of actions. So you might have a system that enforces a particular workflow. So the technology kind of becomes part of the enforcement mechanism in an organisation to reinforce acceptable behaviour. The system, by its design, encourages a certain kind of behaviour. But similarly, people use technology in undesigned kind of ways, in unanticipated kinds of ways. So there's a dual influence there between the technology, the actions people take, and the technology that supports those actions, versus new actions that require new kinds of technology. And similarly, technology can reinforce organisational principles and structures, and those organisational structures will guide human actions. Ołachowski's argument is that the explicit role of technology is about enforcing institutional properties, and that when those institutional properties, those organisational structures are undercut, it tends to happen in a chaotic kind of way, in an unanticipated kind of way. People, users of technology, are generally unaware of their role in either reaffirming or disrupting institutional status quo. And often the way in which institutional properties or expected practice changes comes about in an ad hoc kind of way. So Ołachowski, in one of her papers, talks about a system that was designed over a particular long period of time, and as the system was slowly introduced, they used some a couple of different workflows and processes to work around the limitations of the system as it was being developed. One example of that is the story I told of Peter O'Donnell doing some work for a company that had introduced an accounting system where it didn't support GST around the time that GST was introduced. So for about 6 months or so, they were using comment field number 2 in a spare table somewhere to record GST information. And over time, that became the accepted practice. So even when they introduced a new technology, a new system that actually supported GST, they continued to use comment field number 2 for the GST information. So workflows and practices become the norm over time, often in unanticipated ways. So technologies can transform organisational structures, and they tend to change organisational structures in periods of stress and ambiguity in unstructured situations. So the classic kind of strategic, semi-structured decision problems that Gorey and Scott Morton talked about is exactly the kind of thing that Ołachowski talks about when technology can introduce change. But Ołachowski's identification of that change action, as I said, is often unplanned. That it's by accident that the technology changes things rather than deliberately. So the technology is often introduced as a way to reinforce institutional structures and procedures, and when it does change those structures and procedures, it's done in an unplanned kind of way. It's almost accidental. So my argument is that decision support systems are fundamentally different to classic IT in that by intent, a decision support system is there to introduce change to an organisation. It's developed to help make a strategic, semi-structured decision, And by design, they're there to challenge the norms and accepted ways of doing things in the organisation that currently exist, to introduce a new way of doing things, to make a decision about a new strategic direction, or maybe a change in organisational structure. So as a result, decision support systems subvert the existing organisational structures, and they often operate outside of the accepted procedures and means of enforcement. In other words, the standard corporate governance and IT governance structures that are put in place in an organisation. Decision support systems tend to, not just tend to, but by design, subvert those structures. So in short, DSS challenge the organisational legitimation and domination, and occasionally fundamentally change how the organisation operates and change signification as well. So DSS, by design, are subversive systems. Not just by accident, they are intended to subvert organisational structures, including corporate governance structures. So this is a bit of a contradiction for data warehousing, because data warehouses are there to provide infrastructure. They're classically about structure, but that structure is intended to ultimately subvert organisational structures. So that means that we need to think carefully about how do we govern these kinds of projects, data warehousing and DSS projects, given that governance is about enforcing acceptable actions and decision making, and DSS is about subverting those existing structures. So what I did was I took Olakowski's structuration of technology theory and expanded it a little bit to incorporate governance concepts. So there's plenty of literature out there that talks about the relationship of IT governance and corporate governance, the relationship there, and the importance of corporate strategy defining IT governance. So I've expanded the organisational structures concept to include corporate governance, IT governance, and the corporate strategy. The next thing I did was to expand the human activity concept and expanded that to both systems use and systems development. So there's human action in terms of actually using technology, but there's also human action in terms of developing new technologies as well. So that's human action as much as the usage is as well. And then finally the IT systems themselves. So the lines of influence there, the labels A, B, C and D, come directly from Olakowski's original structure, original model. Which if I go back here, is this one here. So those labels there, they're the same arrows in my expanded version of Olakowski. But what I've done is I've looked at the strength of influence of those arrows and argued that this influence here between system use and system development with normal IT is relatively weak. Oops, too far. And this influence here between the IT systems themselves and the organisational structures is relatively weak, because the changes that happen from IT systems to organisational structures tends to be unintentional with traditional IT systems. Okay, so my argument for decision support systems is that the strength of those influences is quite different for data warehousing and decision support. So the relationship between the organisational structures and the influence on human activity with a decision support system is a lot weaker, because by design the technology is there to subvert and change the organisational structures. So relationship D becomes a much stronger influence, and influence C becomes a much weaker influence. And because of the evolutionary nature of decision support systems and data warehouse use and development, this relationship is much closer than for classic IT development. So let's bring this all back to governance. IT governance is largely about predictability and control, saying who should make decisions and doing it in such a way that it's a planned rather than chaotic or anarchic kind of situation. A lot of management is fundamentally about predictability and control. However, if you buy the argument that DSS are on the one hand chaotic and therefore unpredictable, and subversive and therefore challenge control structures and control mechanisms, how could we apply IT governance to these kinds of systems? There seems to be a direct contradiction there. On the one hand, predictability and control. On the other, unpredictability and challenge to control. Well, we can actually gain some insight from another area of some management literature, and this is management literature that looks at managing creative or innovative business processes. So there's actually quite a bit of literature on managing creative processes, managing designers and those kinds of things. It's actually quite interesting literature to get into. The reason I got into that literature in the first place was for a previous paper that I did for the same conference that this governance paper went to 2 years before. But there's some interesting parallels. So creative processes are processes where people are creating things and where the outcome of the process is by definition undefined. You might have a broad idea of what you want to produce, but the specifics of the creative process, because your creativity is about creating things that are new and novel, is unpredictable. So one of the key things that the literature about managing these kinds of processes talks about is that the teams or the people involved in the process, the actual workers, require flexibility, freedom and autonomy to experiment, play around with things and come up with new ideas, the ability to make mistakes. So there's a different mindset to the traditional kind of management of operational procedures in enterprises, and the avoidance of excessive control. But one of the key interesting findings from the literature on managing these processes is that it can't be carte blanche. You can't just make it a free-for-all for creative teams. Creative teams need clear objectives and goals to guide their experimentation, the creative process. So it's autonomy, flexibility and freedom within clear boundaries. One of the papers that reported this particular finding talked about a creative team that was given carte blanche and another one that was given very clear goals. And the creative team that had no clear goals just spun its wheels. It kept running around and they never actually produced anything concrete. They did lots of designs and drawings and pictures, but never actually produced something physical, whereas the team that had the clear-cut goals actually was much more effective at coming up with an actual product at the end of the process. So creative processes, those which are unpredictable and difficult to control, require clear-cut boundaries, but within those boundaries, the flexibility and the autonomy to make mistakes and combine ideas. So this creates parallels then, I think, for managing the decision support systems process or governing the decision support systems process. And the idea I've come up with is that from a governance perspective, we need a kind of governance sandbox, if you like, that sits outside of the normal IT governance structures. There's a couple of propositions that derive from this and from the literature on creative processes. The first is that an organisation should already have clear and explicit IT governance structures in place so that the organisation knows what the normal governance structure should be. But decision support systems and by extension data warehouses shouldn't be bound by those structures. Even though the decision support system may benefit from those structures in terms of things like data quality and standards and things like that, the DSS and data warehouse shouldn't be constrained by those governance structures as other IT projects would be. There also needs to be very clearly defined scope for DSS development and use. So those clear boundaries within which the autonomy of the development team can operate, there needs to be clear boundaries about which, that say you shouldn't exceed these sort of boundaries. So the scope of those boundaries shouldn't be excessively constraining. There needs to be enough room to allow for flexibility and autonomy and evolution of the decision support tools. And that requires a corresponding level of trust to be placed in the decision support system team. So instead of taking away the responsibility and the autonomy to make significant decisions about the directions of the DSS development and data warehouse development process, there should be trust placed in that team to make informed and responsible decisions within that scope. So what are some implications? Well, if DSS governance has a sort of governance sandbox, a separate area in which different rules kind of apply, it shouldn't be carte blanche. It shouldn't be just a free-for-all. There needs to be clear boundaries. But the flexibility and freedom is still a necessary thing within those boundaries. The other thing that came out of the paper was this idea that, well, IT governance isn't the same thing for all different kinds of IT systems. Different kinds of IT systems may, in fact, need different kinds of governance structures. And that's not present in the governance literature at all. The IT governance literature says, well, here's how you should be making decisions about IT resources. You've got to consider the organisational properties, whether it's a centralised or decentralised kind of organisational culture, but they don't talk about the properties of the technology themselves. So my argument is that not only is there something to be learned for DSS and data warehouse governance, but IT governance as well. The theories informing IT governance need to be informed not just by properties of the organisation, but properties of the systems being governed too. So DSS and data warehousing being fundamentally different require different governance structures. So that's my argument. That's the thrust of where I'm going. It's research. It's exploratory and suggestive in nature. So it's not something which I've gone out and empirically tested yet, but it's an argument based on empirical data. So some future research questions where I think some of this might actually go, and I haven't followed up on these very much yet, but there's something that I'm still thinking about. So if you're interested in governance and you're interested in doing some research as perhaps a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, these are the kinds of things that I might be interested in working with you on. So to what extent does the properties of the task that the technology is being used determine governance requirements? So I've talked about organisational properties and technology properties, but what about the actual task itself? How much scope and flexibility should be given? So how big should the sandbox be? And there's different kinds of DSS technology. Does the same argument for DSS apply to data warehousing as I'm kind of implying? Or perhaps does data warehousing require itself a different kind of governance structure to DSS and other kinds of IT? So what are appropriate mechanisms to help and encourage DSS evolution? And what happens when there's conflicts between DSS governance and data warehouse governance and IT governance? So if there's a conflict, how does that conflict get resolved? Here's a whole bunch of stuff to read on that. I'll skip over that slide. But that brings me to the end. Any questions that you guys have got? No? Notice I've updated my slide. Assignment 2 is due next week, so don't forget that. Which? Governance? Potentially, yeah. I can't tell you what's on the exam. But next week we will talk about the exam structure. So there's a slightly different structure we're using for the exam this semester compared to previous exams. So I'll talk about that next week. Not fundamentally different, but just a slight tweak of the format, which I'll talk about. Questions, comments? No? Okay, well you'll get, for those of you doing 5094, you'll get more governance stuff tonight with David. And you'll get to hear him talk about the Australian Financial Services Company case study. It's a ripper. It's a really good one. So enjoy that. Right, I'll see you guys next week. Cheers. Exactly. Load up on some carbs, keep the brain moving. During the lecture. Yeah. Sorry?
Anthony Giddens.
Yeah,
He
applies to everything. Yes, yeah.
He's like Noam Chomsky also.
Yeah. Yeah. His influence on research extends a long, long way.
Yeah, I think that's a really some of his theories, man.
Yeah, because it's such a general theory. It's it's not just about societies. It's about it applies to any kind of grouping of people and activities that people perform. Which
He had a theory on choosing, on websites when people discuss and stuff.
Yeah.
Choose like characters, not some game. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
You create yourself or something else.
Yeah, I mean the stuff on social media and Web 2.0, Giddens has got to underpin any of that kind of discussion. And it's such an easy theory to wrap your mind around too. It's not like once you get past the terms like signification and domination, and you understand what they mean. But yeah.
And it was well too.
Sorry?
That's the main book in IT governance and strategy. Units. That's the book.
They use Giddens? Or?
That's the book you use in that unit.
Right. You're talking about the unit?
Yeah, the 950, 152 unit, IT governance.
Yeah.
I did that business unit.
I actually don't know much about what goes on in that unit.
It's pretty interesting. Lots of politics in it. And how organizations work socially and politics. And
Yeah, because governance is about responsibility and power.
Yeah.
So it's inherently about politics. It's small scale politics, but it's
It's inter-organization, yeah, very interesting.
yeah.
So, well, I'm doing the SN number 2 as a request from Reza.
Which one's that?
Then the one with which you were talking about, there was doing research on that, which approaches to different types of data warehouse
development?
which there's which the approach is suitable for different types of
Yeah.
data warehousing and stuff like that.
Be fun to work on.
I think I already asked you. I think that about the databases that are currently running for like assignment purposes on data warehousing or business intelligence applications. Do you actually have any like actual databasing running somewhere?
We've got the one that we use for 9003, the database server that we use for 9003. So that's got some of the default databases that come with SQL Server. But you can get hold of that locally. You don't actually have to use our server to do that. So I think that it's called AdventureWorks is the sample database that Microsoft provide, and it's a data warehouse version of that.
Oh, yeah. Is that somewhere somehow available online?
Well, you can if you've got SQL Server installed,
Yeah.
if you've still got the installation media, the disks that you install from.
Just downloaded MySQL.
Not MySQL, it's SQL Server.
Oh, SQL Server. SQL Server. I still do have that from the previous semester, I think.
Okay. If you don't have the installation disk, get the installation disk again from the faculty website.
Yeah.
When you do the installation process, one of the optional installs is the sample database.
Oh, right. Yeah,
So AdventureWorks and AdventureWorks DW. So if you install both of those, then that's there locally for you to play around with.
awesome. Thanks.
And there's a heap of data in there.
Yeah, good. I don't think I just did something to maybe run the server against to get some reports and
Yeah.
breakdowns.
But AdventureWorks DW is the good for that.
Thanks.
Cool.
See you.
Hey. Is Maury?
Yeah, well,
Okay. Cool.
up after class. Okay, so just take some hand notes. Okay.